You may think of science as a large and detailed body of knowledge, and that can sometimes be overwhelming. But science is also the process by which this knowledge is obtained, and it's within those stories that science becomes an amazing feat. Science uses experimentation, evidence, and my favorite thing, logic, to continuously test ideas. Over time and through repeated experimentation and testing, scientific knowledge advances. I wanted to take a few minutes just to share the story of smallpox with you and how experimentation with smallpox actually led us to our first vaccination. A process known as variolation was the first way in which the idea that someone could get an illness, a mild version of an illness, without getting the full-blown illness was achieved. And what they would do is they would take material from the smallpox sores, so that those sores that you see on the young boy on the left, and they would kind of break those open. And then they would either scratch the material into a healthy individual, or they would have the healthy individual inhale it. Oftentimes what would happen is that the individual who had received the variolation would still get sick, but not nearly as sick as if they had come by the smallpox virus on their own. Unfortunately, it wasn't without fatalities. So some people would go through this process and would still get a full-blown case of smallpox, and they would end up dying. And so it was a mission to try to figure out a way to do it better and safer. So we've been accumulating knowledge of vaccines for more than 2 centuries. The actual discovery of the first vaccine, as well as the process of vaccination, dates all the way back to 1796. An English doctor named Edward Jenner had observed that people who became infected with cowpox did not get sick from smallpox. Cowpox was a similar but less severe illness. Edward Jenner decided to transmit cowpox to a young boy whose name was James Phipps, and he was about 8 years old when this happened. And he wanted to see if it would protect him from smallpox. And so he actually took some cowpox by scratching the liquid from some sores of a milkmaid, and he scratched it into a boy's skin. The boy did develop some blisters and some symptoms, but overall was still pretty healthy. 6 weeks later, Edward Jenner brought the boy back in, and he scratched the liquid from some smallpox sores into the boy's skin. As Jenner predicted, the boy was actually fine, and he did not get sick from smallpox. Jenner had discovered the very first vaccine, although additional testing was needed to show that it was really effective. Something for you guys to know about smallpox is that 3 out of 10 people died back then from the actual illness. And even if they didn't die, they were often left with these horrible scars for the remainder of their lives. The World Health Organization actually decided to eradicate smallpox. They felt like it was, once there was a vaccination, they felt like they had a good chance of eradicating it. It was actually eradicated from North America in 1952, so prior to the start of the World Health Organization eradication program. So that began in 1967. In 10 years, they were able to eliminate all cases of smallpox from the globe. So you can see it went from North America prior to the program, the vaccination program, and then the World Health Organization, version of the vaccination program. Definitely people were still getting vaccinated in North America. And then it moved into the South American continent, and then Asia and Africa. And on October 12th, 1977, the last known case of smallpox was eradicated from the world. You can see that Europe and North America were kind of on the same page, and they had already eradicated it prior to the World Health Organization's intervention. What's really important to notice about this, you guys, it's the first actual viral infection that we've been able to, as a human species, eradicate from the planet. So that's pretty cool news. Here's a weird question. Why does a moose have antlers? Have you ever wondered why a moose grows large antlers? The antlers may grow as wide as 6 feet from tip to tip. The antlers oftentimes require a lot of energy to grow and carry around, and they can get caught in brush and trees. In these ways, they would seem more of a detriment than a help, so what purpose do the antlers serve? And why do only male moose grow them? If you've ever asked questions like this about the natural world, then you're already thinking like a scientist. Those of you who are avid outdoorsmen might actually know some of the reasons why, these moose have antlers and why it's worth the energy investment for the moose, specifically the male moose, to be able to put in to that process. But that's thinking like a scientist. When you see an observation and then you ask a question or ask a series of questions, that are testable, that's science, guys. So that's pretty exciting. Science is a distinctive way of gaining knowledge about the natural world that always starts with a question and then tries to answer the question using evidence and logic. It's an exciting exploration of all the whys and hows that any curious person might ask about the world around them. And you guys are a part of that. Besides your curiosity, all you need is a basic understanding of how scientists think and how science is done. And so that's the goal here. It's to learn how to think like a scientist in the context of a biology course. And I'm going to ask you guys to do that constantly. Ask you to ask questions about what you're learning, about the connections that you can make between one bit of content to the next. I'm going to ask you guys to remember things from 7th grade and 8th grade sciences so that you guys can link that prior knowledge to the knowledge that you are gaining throughout this course. I have a picture of, leaves changing in the fall, and we are actually going to do a little bit of something with that here this fall. And the reason why I have it there is it's changing, right? Our environment is changing all around us right now, and I want you to be curious about that. I want you to be asking the whys. What is triggering that? Why is it happening? Where are those colors coming from? Are these things that we can test? The next part of this is scientific law. Now, one of the things that we do need to make sure we're clarifying is the difference between a scientific law and a scientific theory. And I know this is a conversation that you have had in science class at least for the past, 2, if not 3 years. And so hopefully by now you know the difference. But again, my job is to just reemphasize this concept with you. Scientists think of nature as a single system that is controlled by natural laws. By discovering natural laws, scientists strive to increase their understanding of the natural world. Laws of nature are expressed as scientific laws. A scientific law is a statement that describes what always happens under certain conditions in nature. In 7th grade, you guys would have learned about Gregor Mendel, and he's the Austrian monk that used to work with pea plants. And Mendel's laws of inheritance would fall in the category of scientific laws. In the mid-1800s, Gregor Mendel was working with pea plants in his gardens, and he was able to determine some laws that regard or describe how certain traits are inherited from parents by their offspring. Although Mendel discovered the laws of inheritance by experimenting with pea plants, we now know that they actually apply to many other organisms, some of which include humans. The laws describe how we inherit relatively simple genetic traits, such as blood type, from our parents. For example, if you know the blood type of your parents, you can use Mendel's laws to predict your chances of having a particular blood type. This is something that we'll actually do in biology. We'll take a look at different inheritance patterns, look at, for example, the ABO blood typing system, which is just one of many blood typing systems that are out there. It's the most common way that we define what kind of blood that we have. And we can oftentimes look at the blood type of your parents. If we know that information, we can oftentimes determine or narrow down what type of blood you might have. Science is both a process and a body of knowledge, and it's generated through systematic processes such as observation and experimentation. Scientists are always testing and revising their ideas, and as new observations are made, existing ideas may be challenged. Ideas may be replaced with new ideas that better fit the facts, but more often, existing ideas are simply revised. For example, when scientists discovered how genes control genetic traits, they didn't completely throw out Mendel's laws of inheritance because those laws were still relevant. The new discoveries helped explain why Mendel's laws applied only to certain traits but not to others. They showed that Mendel's laws are part of a bigger picture, and through many new discoveries over time, scientists gradually build an increasingly accurate and detailed understanding of the natural world. Now we come to scientific theories, which again, the word theory is often misused in society as a whole. Like, I have gone upstairs and I've heard some of the social studies teachers, I'll pick on Mr. Antonucci, who's like, I have a theory. I have a theory that he says that only because he sees me coming and he knows that it's going to annoy me. But he uses that term jokingly, but oftentimes it is misused. So people are like, I have this theory that, and really what they're doing is they're making a hypothesis. They're making a prediction about something they believe to be true, or in some cases, they're using a theory as an inference. So they're drawing a logical conclusion based on some observation or some data that they have. But a scientific theory is so much more than that. A scientific theory is a broad explanation for events, and scientific theories are widely accepted by the scientific community. To become a theory, an explanation must be strongly supported by a great deal of evidence. Theories have not only, one or two or three experiments to back them up, they have many experiments, many hypotheses, and all of those hypotheses and data that have been collected to support those hypotheses all form one great big theory. I wanted to talk about a quote-unquote early theory, and that is the theory of miasmas. So miasma refers to a toxic vapor that people believe for centuries was a cause of many diseases, including cholera and the plague. The idea that miasma caused disease was first proposed in the 2nd century BCE by a prominent Greek physician named Galen. He believed that miasma, which is identifiable by its foul smell, emanated from rotting organic matter and sickened people who lived close enough to inhale it. Miasma was the predominant explanation for disease transmission from the time of Galen until germ theory of disease became widely accepted in the late 1800s. So the next thing I want to do is just kind of talk about the germ theory of disease, since this is biology and we're in a pandemic, so it's kind of a good mix of both. Germ theory of disease states that contagious diseases are caused by germs or microorganisms, which are organisms that are too small to be seen without magnification. Microorganisms that cause disease are called a pathogen. Human pathogens include bacteria and viruses, amongst other microscopic entities. When pathogens invade humans or other living hosts, they grow, reproduce, and make their host sick. Now, bacteria can do that without the host. They don't need the host replication machinery, and viral infections require actual invasion of a host cell, overtakes the host replication abilities to make multiple copies of itself. Sometimes when the virus exits the cell, it does severe damage, and sometimes it leaves the host unharmed. Diseases caused by germs are contagious because the microorganisms that cause them can spread from one person to another. And again, it depends on what type of infectious disease we're talking about. Sometimes it requires a mosquito vector to be able to carry the illness from one to another. Sometimes, as we're understanding with the SARS-CoV-2, it's just, respiratory droplets or bodily fluids. So the first actual examination of germ theory was in the mid-1500s. I am going to really try hard to say his name, Girolamo Fracastoro. That's an awesome name. So Fracastoro. Fracastoro proposed that the contagious disease is transferable or caused by transferable seed-like entities, which we now are calling germs. So back then he called them seed-like entities that could go from one individual to the next. According to Fracastoro, germs spread through populations through direct or indirect contact between individuals, which make people sick. So this was, going against the theory, the miasma theory, at the same time. And so Fracastoro's idea, though essentially correct, was disregarded by other physicians. Instead, Galen's idea of miasma remained the accepted explanation for the spread of disease for over 300 additional years. However, evidence for Fracastoro's idea accumulated over that time, so over the course of 300 years, more and more people were thinking that there had to be something more than these miasma vapors. Some of the earliest evidence was actually provided by the Dutch lens and microscope maker, Antony van Leeuwenhoek. And you guys have probably heard about him in 7th grade when you were actually studying the first inventors of the microscope. So Leeuwenhoek was considered by many to be the father of microbiology. By the 1670s, he had directly observed many different types of microorganisms under his advanced lens making capabilities, including bacteria. In the 1840s, this is going to be another example of something that is like when I talk about it, you're going to be like, yeah, that's so obvious. But in the 1840s, it was not as obvious. So, one of the first physicians to demonstrate that a microorganism is the cause of a specific human disease was the Hungarian obstetrician Ignaz Semmelweis. And he did this in the 1940s. The disease was purple fever, an often fatal infection of the female reproductive organs. This fever is also known as childbed fever because it usually affects women who have just given birth. Semmelweis observed that deaths from this fever occurred much more often when women had been attended by doctors at his hospital than by midwives at home. Semmelweis also noticed that doctors often came directly from autopsies to the beds of women about to give birth. From his observation, Semmelweis inferred that purple fever was a contagious disease caused by some sort of matter carried to the pregnant patients on the hands of doctors from the autopsied bodies. As a consequence, Semmelweis urged doctors and medical students at his hospital to wash their hands with chlorinated lime water before examining pregnant women. After this change, the hospital's death rate for women who had just given birth fell from 18% to 2%, which was a 90% reduction. Some of Semmelweis's findings are presented in the graph shown on this document. So that top line is showing the deaths from the doctors who had gone to the autopsies and then came back and attended to the women. And the bottom line is that bottom purple line is actually showing the midwives. And you can see that midwives over the course of time just had a lower incident of maternal death. As soon as Semmelweis instituted hand washing and hand hygiene in his hospitals, the attending doctors their data looked almost the same as the midwives. Semmelweis published his results, but they were derided by the medical profession. The idea that doctors themselves were carriers of a fatal disease was taken as a personal affront by his fellow physicians. People did not like the idea that he was saying that these intelligent human beings were the cause of all of these deaths. One of Semmelweis's peers protested indignantly that doctors are gentlemen and that a gentleman's hands are always clean. And as a result of attitudes such as this, Semmelweis became the target of a vicious smear campaign. Eventually, Semmelweis had a mental breakdown and was committed to a mental hospital where sadly he died. So how crazy is that, you guys? The observations that washing hands leads to fewer deaths, and people went after him like crazy because he insulted their intelligence. And that happens so much in the course of scientific discoveries, and sometimes people are afraid to speak up because they don't want to deal with the backlash. And I think you guys could probably think of some examples of that just with what you've experienced or what you've observed in the pandemic so far. I'm going to move on. So throughout the later 1800s, more formal investigations were conducted about the relationship between germs and disease, and some of the most important were undertaken by Louis Pasteur. Pasteur was a French chemist who did very careful experiments to show that fermentation, food spoilage, and certain diseases were caused by microorganisms. He discovered the cause of purple fever in 1879, and he determined it was an infection caused by the bacterium Streptococcus pyogenes, and this is what you're seeing under this magnification, so these purple bacteria. Now, because he was actually able to show that, and he was able to show that those things can be carried on your skin and on your hands, people then were more willing to accept the fact that you need to wash your hands before you go from an autopsy to a surgery or an autopsy to attending the birth of a woman. And once these things started taking hold and germ theory really started taking hold, a lot less people died because not only were doctors being more careful, but this was being taught, and encouraged of house, housewives and husbands and children. And as hygiene increased, the number of people getting sick just in general were decreasing. Another thing that they found was that a lot of these germs were carried in water and carried in sewage, and sometimes the sewage was contaminating the drinking water. And so learning practices like boiling your water to, kill those microorganisms became a common practice, and fewer people were getting sick. So things that, again, we take for granted in our society were big ideas. And a lot of people had a lot of pushback. So even Louis Pasteur, his experimentations were very well designed, and we'll cover those in greater depth later on in the course. Something to know about this particular strain of strep, it's known as Group A. It grows in chains and causes numerous infections in humans, some of which would be tonsillitis, scarlet fever, cellulitis, and my favorite, not that I would ever want to get it, and it's the most awful version of this bacterial infection, necrotizing fasciitis. What's interesting about this is the reservoirs for these Group A strep in nature are only found on the skin and mucous membranes of the human host. I had a student whose father was a construction worker when I taught in Hayward. And the craziest thing happened. He was at work and his shirt had kind of slipped up between his pants and his tool belt. And normally his shirt had protected his tool belt from rubbing on his skin. And he'd been working and it was a particularly hot day. And his tool belt was rubbing, but he was sweating, and he was sweating so much he didn't really notice, but it had rubbed a really big raw sore, and he didn't really think anything of it. And the next day, when he was getting ready for work, he noticed that the sore had increased. Not only had it increased, but his skin was on fire, and he had a really bad fever. And so he kind of just took the day off. By that evening, his skin was inflamed, and it looked like the infection was spreading. And so he actually went into Hayward. Immediately, they were able to diagnose it as necrotizing fasciitis, which is basically that strep bacteria starts to eat your skin. So it just starts to eat you alive. And he was life flighted basically up to Duluth, which is kind of an interesting connection. So he was life flighted up to Essentia, where he was basically fighting for his life for months. And they kept on having to cut away skin and cut away more skin to try to save him. Fortunately, he was able to be saved. He had to undergo several surgeries to repair all of the damage. Not everybody is as lucky. So this Group A strep lives on the surface of some humans, and normally it's fine, it doesn't do anything. But if it gets into an open cut or an open sore, it can turn and just start to basically eat away the flesh of its host. So glad that we have antibiotics now, and glad that we have a good understanding of it so that it doesn't affect people nearly as much as it used to. All right, I'm just trying to think of anything else that I might want to share. I would just say, although Pasteur was not the first person to propose the germ theory, his investigations definitely helped to support it. He also became a strong proponent of the theory and managed to convince most of the scientific community of its validity. And for these reasons, Louis Pasteur is often regarded as the father of germ theory, and he is definitely someone that we can say thank you to for our current understanding of some of those basic mitigation measures as we go through our own pandemic. All right, that's going to conclude part 1, and the next lecture that you guys will be listening to is just some review of what scientific investigations are. So a little bit less of the history and more just those technical vocabulary terms.